Spanish settlers arrived in Hispaniola, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and other islands in the first 2 decades after Columbus's arrival. Hernán Cortés landed in Mexico and conquered the advanced Aztec civilization. In 1531, Francisco Pizarro landed in Peru and did the same thing to the Incas. Spain's discovery of the New World had considerable consequences for both sides. The Indians would most likely die in meaningless resistance of or from European diseases to which they had no immunity. Smallpox, chickenpox, whooping cough, diphtheria, malaria, measles, yellow spotted fever, and even the bubonic plague. A population of perhaps 50 million in 1492 sank to 5 million by 1700. Survivors were enslaved to work the plantations of the gold and silver mines of Mexico and Peru. Some eventually intermarried within their conquerors, producing new peoples. When the native population began to die out, Spain and Portugal started importing enslaved people from Africa. Finally, come 10 million people in the New World were abducted, sold, transported, and worked, often to death. Brazil had 2.5 million nomads and settled people in small tribes with distinct languages. Unlike Mesoamerica or the Andes, Brazilian sugarcane cultivation by Portuguese settlers in the 1520s created a new form of colonization of the Americas. Huge plantations worked by enslaved people. This model expanded Caribbean-wide. The first successful English settlement was Jamestown, Virginia, founded in 1607. It first struggled to generate enough food and faced Powhatan hostility. Late 17th century tobacco production for a rising European market helped it prosper. Enslaved Africans replaced indentured servants as tobacco and rice plantation laborers, creating a stark racial division. Random and decentralized English colonization increased colonial autonomy and diversity. English settlers were predominantly agricultural. Rapid west of Montreal ended Jacques Carter Sr.'s Lawrence Rivers exploration. The French era in Mississippi began in 1682 when René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salette, claimed the land of France while exploring the Mississippi. The French government took major steps to garrison and develop the province into a colony in the 1690s. The French foundation Quebec, Montreal, Detroit, Green Bay, St. Louis, Mobile, Biloxi, Baton Rouge, and New Orleans. The Caribbean did not remain under Spanish control. Islands became crucial stops between the New World and Europe. In the early 1600s, non-Hispanic privateer traders and settlements founded permanent settlements and trading centers on Spanish-ignored lands. Although early conquests and settlements were primarily private, the Spanish and Portuguese governments quickly took direct control over the possessions. Spanish lands were separated into two viceroyalties or administrative divisions. One in New Spain, founded in 1535 with New Mexico City at its seat, and one in Peru, founded in 1542. In the 1530s, the Portuguese established captaincies, hereditary land grants to nobility and loyal officials for settlement and administration expand Brazil. The Catholic Church was crucial to Iberian authority in the Americas. By the end of the 17th century, France ruled its North American colonies directly. Wealthy merchants and landowners dominated English colonists, autonomous assemblies, although even commoners enjoyed more political power than in England. Spanish Reconquista military leaders were rewarded with the encomenda. The conquistadors allowed the encomendados to secure the indigenous people as laborers and charge tribute to exchange for food, shelter, and Christian teaching. Despite a 1512 Spanish edict requiring indigenous people to be treated humanely, the encomienda led to overwork, beatings, and sexual violence. King Charles first addressed their criticisms in 1542 with new over the encomiendas, but forced indigenous people to pay tributes to cash instead of labor. In modern Spain and Peru, royal officials developed repartimento and mita, government-run forced labor systems. Workers earned meager wages to pay tribute. Many early explorers chose to marry native women and use them as translators, guides, and allies. English culture strictly distinguished between civilized and savage, preventing males from marrying indigenous women. In contrast, New France royal officials encouraged French traders to marry indigenous women to create ties with natives. African women made up 4/5 of Atlantic immigrants between 1800. The masters had regularly had sexual relationships with slave women. Portuguese, Spanish, and French colonies had a large number of free black descendants from such coupling, but English owners were less inclined to free children they fathered with enslaved women. Mixing indigenous people with Europeans and Africans created a new population with ethnicity and modeled self-identity. Spanish Americans called persons of mixed Native American European descent mestizo, whereas mulatto were African and European. The Columbian exchange was a process involving the exchange of animals, plants, and diseases throughout migration. Early conquistadors brought cattle, sheep, and goats, introducing Native Americans to meat and milk. The horse-led Spanish conquistadors and native population traveled quicker and farther, delivering enormous loads of maize that became a staple in Spain, Portugal, southern France, and Italy. It became a popular meal in southeastern Europe and South China in the 18th century. Even more significant was the nutritious white potato that progressively traveled from west to east, spurring population growth everywhere. Disease was likely the most important exchange. After 1492, the Western Hemisphere saw a devastating pandemic. The Ottomans stopped the flow of white slaves from the eastern Mediterranean and reduced Muslim prisoners, cutting Europe from their traditional slave supplies. Mediterranean Europe moved to sub-Saharan Africa and had a long history of slave trading. Portuguese explorers searched the western coast of Africa for slaves and returned to Lisbon with the first cargo in 1444. Small raiding teams took the first captives, but Portuguese merchants found it easier to trade with local African chiefs who were used to dealing in enslaved people, kidnapped in wars with neighboring powers. Portuguese traders imported hundreds of enslaved Africans to Lisbon yearly from 1490 until 1530, making up 10% of the population. In the 15th century, people were wealthy. Growth increased European demand for sugar, a difficult crop to produce for profit. European enslaved Africans and native islanders do the hard work. The transatlantic slave trade began in 1518 when Charles V allowed traders to transfer African slaves to the Americas. The Dutch West Indian Company brought thousands of Africans to Brazil and the Caribbean to work on sugar plantations after its foundation in 1621. From 1660 through 1698, the Royal African Company monopolized its slave trade for the English crown. Slaves from Africa died on the Atlantic. 20% died on the cruise, mostly from dysentery caused by poor food, water, overcrowding, and sanitation. According to scholars, European traffickers transported almost 10 million enslaved Africans over the Atlantic from 1518 to 1800, of which 8.5 million disembarked compared to 2.5 million Europeans who moved to the New World. Slaves worked as miners, warriors, sailors, servants, artisans, and various crops. Sugar plantations were the toughest. At Potosi, Bolivia, and Ease, acquired from the Inca Empire, the Spanish found an extraordinary silver source in 1545. Potosi and secondary mines in Guantanamo, Mexico, produced 35 million pounds of silver and over 600,000 pounds of gold. In the 16th century, steady population growth and a sharp rise in demand for food and goods that Spain could not meet caused widespread inflation, exacerbated by the influx of silver because Spain's King Philip II had paid his army and foreign debts with it. China demanded half the world's silver for its products and imperial taxes. Europeans discovered the Americas and explored the Pacific, linking the world for the first time via seaborne trade and creating the Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch empires. The Portuguese controlled sea routes to India in the 16th century, selling horses from Mesopotamia and copper from Arabic, hawks and peacocks from India to Chinese and Japanese markets, Asian spices brought from Indian textiles, and East African gold and ivory black to Portugal from Brazil. The Portuguese returned sugar from African slaves and they had brought over the Atlantic. In Manila, Spanish dealers in silver from American miners to buy Chinese silk, which was in high demand in the European marketplace. With the creation of the Dutch East India Company in 1602, the Dutch Spice Empire challenged Spain and Portuguese. One of the main reasons for European expansion was the emphasizing indigenous people. Columbus' second voyage sent the first missionaries to the New World, and over 2,500 Franciscans, Dominican Jesuits, and other fire crossed the Atlantic in the century that followed. They were among the most vocal opponents of Spanish letters and abuses. Missionaries taught indigenous people European agriculture and encouraged allegiance to colonial masters. Officials were dubious of their full conversions and their belief in old ways. One of the most and far vociferous critics in indigenous people cruel treatment was attorneys debated the subject. Although both sides won the debate, it had little impact on the Americas. Northern Europeans created the black legend of Spanish colonialism because the Spanish were ruthless and cruel in the conquest and settlement of the Americas, which enabled them to overlook historical violence and exploration. Most Europeans considered African pagans, heathens, or Muslim unbelievers, while the Irish, Jews, and peasants were aliens and inferior. Europeans looked to Africa for slaves and used the assumption that Africans were primitive and barbaric to justify slavery and claim that Christianity brought their salvation. Europeans required racial superiority and inferiority to protect slave trade profits. As Europeans at home and in the colonial believed blacks were destined to be slaves, dark skin became with slavery. The notion was based on artistical claim that certain people were destined for servitude and biblical correlations between darkness and immorality. Michael de Montaigne wrote Skepticism and Cultural Evolution articles in 1580, creating the essay genre. Montaigne described his government experiences and morality in French and from ancient texts. The essay from Overseas Discovery, significant, was one of the most read of the time. His essay of Cannibals argued against cultural superiority. Few of his friends would have agreed. His popular essay changed mindsets and ushered in the new era of uncertainty. William Shakespeare was the period literary maestro, known for his characterization, storylines, psychology, and language skills. Shakespeare, a Renaissance man who loved classical culture, individualism, and humanism, composed plays that addressed a wide range of human issues that have practically unlimited interpretation. Shakespeare, like Montaigne, shows how the day's findings and interactions affected him. In Othello, the main character is a black Moorish general. Shakespeare's misgivings regarding Moors' inferiority in racial and religious categories may explain such disparities. Modern academies see parallelism between Shakespeare's last play, The Tempest, which explores race and race relations, the imperial invasion settlement. Shakespeare's play quotes Montaigne's of Cannibals, showing was criticizing racial views of all time.